Hello, am I audible now? Sorry about the internet connection. I was saying that welcome to the fifth tutorial for forests and their management. And I'm Geetika Agarwal. I'm a PhD scholar at the Center for Ecological Sciences, and today I'll be taking this tutorial. I hope you've gone through the lectures of this week. If not, then there'll be a small summary of what happened during this week. We'll discuss the contents of the week, and then we'll have a short quiz later. So let's keep the session interactive. If anybody has any doubts, they can stop me and ask me questions that they might have. And yeah, otherwise, if you want to say something, you have comments or anything, you can either type them out in the chat box or unmute yourself and let me know. Okay, so moving on. So, for this week in forests and their management, we talked about forest surveying and how there are different methods of surveying forests. And what was mostly discussed were how to use classical tools in order to measure things. So this week mostly looked at measuring like the terrain or like the landscape, like a bigger picture, not like in like we discussed about forest mensuration last week, where we talked about how to measure singular trees and the girth of the tree, the diameter of the tree, the height, and all of those things. This week we mostly discussed how do you in general look at the terrain, and what is like the elevation, and what is the canopy height, and things like that. So there were lectures talking about how to use classical tools to do that, and then how do you use geometry and photogrammetry, and then how do you use lidar. Okay, so this was what was majorly discussed during this week. So coming to the first lecture, we talked about forest surveys. So what is survey? So can you guys tell me what do we mean by the term survey? What does somebody mean when they talk about, okay, we're going to be carrying out a survey? Anybody would like to take like a wild guess on like what does it mean to survey something? Okay, so survey basically refers to the act of measuring. So in general, if you talk about survey, it's about measuring things. For example, if you're carrying out, say, a census or like a population survey, for example, say the government is carrying out some Janganna or like a census of the people in a certain state, then they come around and they carry out a survey and they ask from house to house how many members are there. So that's a basic thing, a basic survey where you basically are measuring something and trying to gather some information about the thing that you're interested in. When it comes to a forest survey or when it comes to a landscape survey, what we're trying to do is we're trying to measure the relative proportions of natural and man-made features. So if you talk about a landscape, for example, you have like a village. In the edge of the village you have forest, and then you have some fields, then you have some houses, you have some roads, some well, and things like that. So there is a mix of natural and man-made features, and you're trying to measure the relative proportions of these on the earth's surface, and then you want to present this information either graphically or numerically. So more or less, maybe you want to build a map of that area, or you want to like look at the topography. So you all might have like done this in your high school, where in geography you have to look at maps, or you have to study topo sheets, and you have to look at those contour lines and see what is the elevation of that area, and things like that. So this is what we're talking about during this week. This is the kind of surveys that were talked about, and how do you how do you conduct these surveys. So there are multiple stages to carrying out a survey. First of all, if you want to conduct a landscape survey, you want to conduct a reconnaissance or a recce. So you do a recce visit. So if say a government employee wants to carry out a survey of a particular land, or for example, you as a student want to conduct a project in some area, so you first have to visit that area in a recce, and during that you take a general view of the whole area. So you look around, you see, okay, this much land comes under forest in this area, and this much is built up land where you have roads and you have houses and you have shops and things like that. So you basically go around and take a general view of what all is actually there. From there, you choose, say, one or more reference points. So you'll choose some reference points that, okay, fine, at this point, I want to set up like a reference, and I want to use this point as a reference point. And from here, I'll measure the distances of all the other points. So, for example, you wanna survey a particular piece of land, and maybe you're a builder, you wanna buy a particular piece of land, or maybe you wanna start a new farm and you wanna see how much of the land is there which is fallow and which can be cultivated, or which has like good amount of soil and things like that. So you choose a reference point. You can either have one reference point, or you can have multiple reference points based on your logistics. And so after choosing a reference point, of this point you need to know the exact location. So by using GPS or something, you know the exact location of this point. And then using this as the ground control point, you measure the distance and the angle of every other point from this point. So for example, you have a field which is, say, hexagon in shape. So you choose the farthest points, the farthest 6 points. And for example, you have some point in between which you choose as the center. So from there, you measure the distance of all the farthest points and the angles. And then when you connect all of them on paper, you'll have basically like a map, or which you can scale based on how you're using it. So for example, you can have like 1 centimeter on paper is equal to, say, 10 meters on land. So things like that. So you first of all, to carry out a survey, you need to carry out a recce visit to the land and get a general view of the area and choose one or two reference points. Then you have to make observations and conduct measurements. So you observe the place, observe the land, and look at the points, and then you have to conduct the measurements. So from the point that you chose, the reference point that you chose, as I said, you will measure, say, the distances and the angles of every other point that you want to include in your landscape. Then you have to present this data, because what is the point of collecting data if you're not basically using it for some purpose or the other? So you need to present this data. Either you'll do it that digitally, because in modern day, we a lot of the times we digitally present our data, or in the olden times you did it on paper, for example, like a graph paper or a topo sheet, as I said. So you want to present the data. So these are the three stages of survey. You first go look at the area, you make your observations and measurements, and then you present the data. That's it. Then, talking about the Earth's sheet. So, in more or less most of these surveys, you can either consider Earth to be flat, or you can consider the actual shape of the Earth. So, can somebody tell me what is the actual shape of the Earth called? Like, what is the shape of the Earth? Is it a circle? Is it an ellipse? Or is it something else? Like, there's a term, a specific term that's used to describe the shape of the earth. Is anybody aware of that? So anyway, so the shape of the earth is basically, earth is thought, or earth is a geoid. So it has this irregular shape, which is actually based on like the distribution of land and water in the earth. And when you look at it, so different locations are measured, and this is what it'll look if you keep the terrain in view. If you take out the terrain, then it'll more or less look like a geoid. And then these are the different points that you measured. And if you then zoom into these points, you'll see that there's a curvature, and then this is your area and still curved. But if you zoom in further, you'll think of it as flat land. That is why humans in old time thought of earth as a flat piece of land, right? So when you're conducting your landscape survey, you can either consider earth as a flat land, or you can consider the actual shape of the earth. So that's the type of surveys. So based on the area, how much area you want to survey, it can either be a plain survey, where you're talking about a small area which is mostly less than 250 kilometers square, and in this, the surface of the earth is considered to be more or less flat. Then there's a geodetic survey. which, as the term suggests, it takes into account the true shape and the curvature of the earth. And this is mostly conducted for larger areas which are more than 250 kilometer squares. So when your area gets more than this particular value, it somehow you need to account for the shape of the earth, the curvature of the earth's surface. So that is why, based on area, you have two types of surveys that you can carry out, plane or geodetic. Then, based on the instruments you are using to carry out the survey of the landscape, you have different types of survey. One of them, first of them, is the chain and tape survey, which is the most basic one. As the term suggests, you have a chain and then you have a tape. And using this chain and tape instruments, you are carrying out linear measurements. So, as we said, we have a reference point. From that point, we want to measure the distance of every other point. So, you use the chain and tape and you measure the distances of the different points. Here you're not taking any angular measurements, okay? And say you have a rectangle, and from the center you, or from one of these points, you know the distance of all the other points. You still won't be able to just draw the rectangle because you don't know what exactly is the angle of the other points, okay? Not a rectangle, like a um, one second, I seem to have lost my internet. Yeah. uh, Yeah, so I was saying, say you have like a shape with four sides, so and you wanna, okay, what is happening to the internet today? Hi, am I audible? I seem to have lost my internet again. So can somebody tell me if I'm audible and is my screen visible to everyone? Okay, thank you so much. So, yeah, so you basically take a reference point and you measure the distances of every other point from this point, but you do not make any angular measurements. Okay. Then you carry out a compass survey, whereas the term suggests compass, you use the compass to get angular measurements. So you're taking your linear measurements using chain and tape when you're taking your angular measurements using a compass. And for measuring the angles, again from your reference point, you draw a line with respect to the magnetic north at that point, and from that, from that straight line, at your point where is the magnetic north, and from that line you measure the angle of all the other points that you want to measure in your landscape, and that is how you'll lead to the shape that you finally get on paper. So that's the compass survey. Then there's a plane table survey, in which what you're trying to do is you take measurements on the field and you want to convert them into a drawing on the paper. So on a plane table, you want to convert all the measurements taken on field into a drawing on the paper. And here you use two reference points. And you take, say you have point A and point B. From these, on and you know the distance between these 2 points. So for example, these 2 points are 10 meters apart on land. So you take point A and point B. From these 2 points you measure the angle of every other point, and from that you end up with a triangle, and you don't really need the distance, the actual distance of that point from your reference point A or B. You, from the angles that you're getting, from the angles that that point is subtending at point A and point B, you can actually map it by using proportions onto paper. So if you are saying 10 meters on land is 1 centimeter on paper, you can directly draw that 1 centimeter line between A and B, and using the same angles you can draw all the reference or all the original points that you're trying to measure on land. So that's plane table survey. And there's one more which is called a theodolite survey. Theodolite is an instrument which measures both the vertical and the horizontal angles. Again, here you're not going around measuring the distances, but by using the horizontal and the vertical angles that the theodolite gives you, you can actually estimate the distance and the height of the object that you're trying to survey. Okay. So, for example, you have a point, and from here you're trying to see how far is that particular tree and what is the height of the tree. So, using the theodolite, you can get these two angles, and then you can just estimate what is the distance of the tree and what is the height of the tree or of the building, anything that you are, or of the bridge, anything that you're looking at in the landscape. So, these are the different types of surveys. And Here is an image showing how a chain tape survey works. So basically, there are two people, they have one reference point. From here, you start measuring the distance of the points that you want to consider. And here you can see between the points A and D, there is one line which is called the baseline. And from the baseline, you start measuring the distances of the other points, right? Then this is what is called the plane table survey. So here on your table, what you have the distance. So you have two reference points. Here, consider BD as the two reference points. From here, you measure the angle of every other point, and you can basically um, draw them on the table. So for BDC, the capital BDC on, so for example, your two reference points are B and C, and D is the point I'm measuring. On paper, you can then draw the BC, and based on the angles that D is subtending on point B and point C, you can draw the D on paper as well without knowing the actual distance. Then this is what the compass survey uses. This is basically a compass to tell you the angle of different points from where you're standing. And then there's this theodolite, which tells you the horizontal and vertical angles of the objects, and then you can just measure the distance and the height. So these are the four different ways of carrying out surveys. Then we talk about the types of measurements that you take. So in the last lecture also about forest mensuration, we were talking about the types of measurements, and a very basic discussion was types of measurements based on whether you're doing carrying out a direct measurement or an indirect measurement. So in a direct measurement, you're directly using the measuring device or the instrument, and you're getting the reading, and that directly gives you the distance or the height. In an indirect measurement, you are not exactly directly measuring the height, but you're using an observable ratio or an observable proportion. So the example of direct measurement, as in the previous thing we saw, if you're actually using the tape to measure the distance, then that's a direct measurement. Here the person is actually using the tape to measure the height of the tree, then that is also a direct measurement. Indirect, as we saw in the last week, if you are actually measuring the height of the tree by using shadow method, and you're looking at what is the length of the shadow of the tree and what is the length of the shadow of a known height, then you can estimate the height of the tree. So that is indirect method, where you're using an observable proportion to get to the final measure. Okay, so these were the types of surveys and types of measurements that can be used. Then, as you all might know, every measurement comes with an error. So when you're measuring something, because you don't know the true value and you are estimating the value, you'll always end up with an error. And error is the difference between the measured value and the true value. So you all might be aware of this already, and every measurement comes with an error. So EI can be shown as xi minus mu I, where mu I is the true value, xi is the value that we measure, and EI is the error, which is the difference between our measured value and the true value. And so basically, as you all might know, no measurement is exact, which means that all measurements will have some or the other error. So true value is never known, and we can only reach to an estimate by minimizing our error bars. So you will never know the true value of something because there's always going to be an error of some sort or the other. Either it's a human error, or it's an error because of the instrument being faulty, or something or the other will happen. So the true value is never really known, and we only reach an estimate which can be close to the true value, and that is done by minimizing the error. And the exact error will also never be known, since mu I is never known. Therefore, EI will also never be known. So, exact error or the exact or the true value of the measurement can never be known. Okay. Moving on to what are the different sources of errors. So, how do we end up getting errors in our measurement? So, one of the sources is having a natural error, which means because of some natural reasons, you end up with an error. For example, if you're using a steel ruler, now, because of the ambient temperature, the ruler will either expand or will contract based on the temperature. So, for example, at a normal temperature, for example, say 20 degrees, the ruler is 1 meters in length, and it stays that much. But if you're going out and you're measuring something in the sun, and say the ambient temperature is like 35, 40, this ruler would have expanded even a tiny bit, which will lead to an error in your measurements. So because of the natural conditions, your instrument or something in the environment is getting altered, which is leading to an error in your measurements. Okay, then there is an instrumental error. Say that the instrument itself is faulty. For example, if you're using, like we were looking at calipers being used to measure tree diameters, right? So if the instrument itself is faulty, for example, there is a zero error, or if the ruler that you have, which says that it is 1 meter, was actually not cut at 1 meter but was cut at 0.995 or something like that, then you will have a very teeny tiny error just because your instrument itself has a fault. Then then there is personal errors which come due to human usage of the thing. So because we as humans always tend to do some mistakes. So when you're carrying out the measurement, you might have like put the, so if you're measuring distance between point A and point B, you might have, and say it is like three ruler lengths between A and B, and you have to put them in a straight line. Say you end up putting them at slight angles and not really at the straight line, so you might end up with a distance which is slightly longer than 3 meters. So that would be because of the human error. Or for example, you're using a tape and you end up measuring a slightly more or less length of the same thing. So if any of you would have conducted like experiments, some physics experiments in the lab, there's always this thing where you measure the error in your measurements. So you are measuring the length of the same thing over and over again. Always you'll end up with some point 0.1 or point 0.2 millimeters more or less than the actual value. So that is because of human errors. Even if the instrument is fine, the conditions are all correct, you'll still end up with some sort of an error. So we can have natural errors, instrumental errors, or personal errors, which is human errors. Then there are these two things. One is precision and one is accuracy. So there's the measurements can be precise, or the measurements can be accurate, or the measurements can be both precise and accurate. So can somebody tell me what is the difference between precise measurements and accurate measurements? So what is the difference between the terms precision and accuracy? You might have encountered this already in your high school or in UG, somewhere where where you might be talking about measuring something, for example, like, um, measuring the length of something or measuring time, something like that. So, what is the difference between precision and accuracy? Would anybody like to take a guess? You can unmute yourself or you can type it out in the chat box. Like, what do you think? What do you think is accuracy? Nobody would like to take a guess, or
Accuracy refers that how closely the measured value to a true or a correct value.
Mhm.
Precision is somewhat or nearly to that actual value, I think.
Very good. Accuracy, you're correct. Accuracy is how close is the measured value to the true value or the value that we're trying to estimate. But precision is actually how close are your measured values to each other. How precisely has somebody been able to take the measurements? So, for example, somebody is measuring the length of, say, for example, the length of a trail, and you're measuring and measuring. So, in once you get 10 meters, one you get 10.1, then you get 10.2, then you get 900 meters. Oh, sorry, yeah, zero point 0.9 meters or something like that. Then these would be precise. These, like, looking at these values, you can talk about precision. How precise are the values? How close are the measured values to each other? And when you're talking about accuracy, for example, say you have that the actual length of that trail is somewhat around 10 meters, and say your average of all the values of your measurements reaches to somewhat around 10 meters, then you would say that okay, these values were more or less accurate, the measurements were more or less accurate. and whether they were precise or not is a separate question. So, looking at this image here, so we have these four circles where we have different measurements shown at different areas. So, can you tell me which ones of these are precise, which ones are accurate, and which ones are accurate and precise? So, in the first one, you have points scattered around. In the second one, you have the points clumped together but away from the center. In the next one, you have points more or less around the center but a little bit scattered. And in the last one, you have all of them smack in the middle of the circle. So, can you tell me which of these are precise and which of these are accurate?
Third one is precise and fourth is accuracy.
So, if you're looking at this and calling this the third one, you're saying it is precise. Okay. So, as we said, precision is actually the closeness of the measured points. So, when you look at these four figures, you see that 2 and 4 are the ones which have high amount of precision. But in 2, the accuracy is low because they're away from the center. And in 4, the accuracy is high because they're all at the center. In the first one, both precision and accuracy are low because none of them are telling the exact value. So even if you average them out, you're not gonna get to the center. So the accuracy is low. In the third one, the accuracy is high because more or less, if you get the average, you'll reach the center. But the precision is low because the measurements are far away from each other. Okay. So in these images, if you look at which ones are precise, it's the second and the fourth one because the measurements are very close, they're clumped together to each other. And which ones are accurate are the third and fourth because they are more or less at the center. Okay. So I hope that was clear. So that's how you look at precision and accuracy in measurements. Then we come to bias. So when you're talking about bias, bias talks about how different is the mean of your measured values from the true value or the reference value. So here is the reference value which you're trying to get at. So how far away from here is the mean of your measured value? So this distribution shows all of your measured values, and the mean here or the average is this center value, the central line. So bias tells you how far away is the mean of your measured values from the reference value. And if the reference value here is the true value, then bias will be equal to the error in the measurement. Okay. So measurement bias is a systematic error in research where observed values they consistently deviate from the true value, and which leads to distorting results. So that's a measurement bias. Basically it could be either because say your instrument is faulty, so every time you take the measurement it's always going to end up being a little bit biased, or a little there's going to be error. uh, it's not going to be correct to the it's not going to be equal to the reference value because your instrument that you're using itself is faulty. So that's what is bias. It's the difference between the mean of the measured values and the reference value. And bias can be removed by calibrating your instrument. So one of the ways of removing bias is that you calibrate the instrument you're using. For example, your instrument has some zero error, so you correct that error and then you start using the instrument. That is going to reduce the bias in your measurements. Okay. Now we talk about census versus sampling. So as I've already discussed earlier, census is when or okay, anyway, can somebody here tell me what is the difference between census and sampling? I already gave a little bit of a hint earlier in the lecture, but yeah, does anybody have an idea of what is census and how is it different from sampling? Okay, so when we talk about census, this is so if there's a population of say anything that you're trying to survey, for example, there's a population of trees or there's a population of tigers or population of birds, anything that you're working on, if in that population, that means the if you're covering each and every individual in the population. For example, say you're trying to get tree heights for a particular area. For say example, you have a forest and you want to measure tree heights. So the census would be if you are actually going to each and every tree and measuring its height. So if you're taking into account each and every individual in the population, that is when you call it a census. So you measure the value from all individuals in the population. Sampling, on the other hand, is when you choose a subset of the population, and this subset we call sample. And according to us, this sample should be a good representation of the population, and it would reproduce the important characteristics of the population that we're trying to get as closely as possible. So, for example, you have a forest, it has 100 trees, but you cannot go around and measure the height of all the 100 trees. So you choose a subsample of, say, 15 trees. And from these 15 trees, you measure their heights and you get an average value. Now you can say that, okay, according to me, this sample is a good representative of the population. So whatever average I'm getting for the heights from this sample of 15 trees, I can say that that is the average height of all the trees in my population area. So even if you're not measuring the height of each and every tree in that landscape, but since you use a sample and you say that the sample represents my population, you just use that value and you say that, okay, this is a good representation of the population as well. So that is the difference between census and sampling. From here, you can see if you look at a human population and you're trying to say again measure the heights of each and every individual, census would be you go around and actually measure the height of each and every individual to get an average, and a sample would be you choose a sample from the population and you just measure the height for these 8 individuals, and then you use that as a measure for the average height for the entire population. Okay, so that was census versus sampling. Then there are certain terms that we use in sampling. One of them, as I said, is population. Population is when it includes all of the units that can be from which the sample can be chosen. So all of the humans that you can actually, for example, if you're talking about that, okay, I want to measure the heights of all students in 10th standard. So all of these students of 10th standard in that particular school will be a population. From this, you can choose the sample, which can be a representative of the population. So, aggregate of the units from which the sample can be chosen is the population. Sampling units. Now, there's another term called sampling units, which is actually the administrative or the natural units. For example, if you're talking about if you're talking about a forest or if you're talking about a landscape, it can be the topographical sections and the subcompartments in that. So basically, the sampling units are the actual proportion of the population that is available for you to actually go and do that measurement on. Then there's a frame. A frame includes a list of these sampling units. So when all of these sampling units are put into a list, that's called the frame. And a sample, as we said, is one or more sampling units selecting from the population according to a specific criteria. So there are different sampling criteria. Based on those, you can choose samples. So a list of these sampling units is called a frame, and each of these sampling unit is called a sample. So one or more of the sampling units that you select is called a sample. And sampling intensity talks about how rigorously you've sampled your population. So, if the number of units that you choose in the sample is close to the number of units in the population, then your sampling intensity is high. If the number of units in the sample is very less than the number of units in the actual population, then your sampling intensity is low. So, it's basically a ratio of number of units in the sample to the number of units in the population. Okay. So, here is a graph, or here is an image where you can look at uh, which is a representative of this terminology. So, for example, this is USA, and you're trying to get some data from the population of USA. So, that's the theoretical population. Then you have a study population. For example, the population that you can actually get access to. So, for example, you are from New York, so you can only access the nearby areas. You can't go around the entire country to get that data. So basically, that will be your study population, or that will be your sampling units from which you can actually get the data. And then how do you access them as the sampling frame? You basically either get the telephone directory, or you get some other kind of information to find where everybody stays or whatever. If you want to conduct a survey, you will have to like reach them person to person and stuff like that. And then who actually ends up in your study will actually be the sample. So those units which actually end up being surveyed will be the sample. Okay, so that is all about the different terminology used in sampling. Then, as I said, there are different criterias based on which you can choose your sample, and that's called the types of sampling. One of them is simple random sampling. Then there is systematic sampling, there's stratified sampling, multi-stage sampling, and PPS, probability proportion to sampling. So these terms are quite self-explanatory, but we'll go in the details of these. So there's a simple random sampling. Um, you can see in this image. So from this population, you randomly choose people. So you randomly choose some greens and some blues. And that's your simple random sampling, which is purely random. Then there's systematic sampling. So, for example, you start from some random person, and then after that, you choose systematically the next individual. So, for this, you choose every alternate individual. So, that is a form of systematic sampling because you're systematically choosing the individuals or the entities that can be a part of your sample. Then there's stratified sampling. So, here the population has been divided into two subsections, the green and the blue, and then you choose an equal number of samples from these two subsections. So that's the stratified sampling. Then there is multi-stage and PPS sampling that we'll come to in the next slides. So as I said, simple random sampling, every possible combination of sampling units out of the population has the same probability of being selected. So every individual in the population has the same probability of getting selected in your sample. So that is some simple random sampling. So it's entirely random. If you have 1 to 1,000 individuals, each one of those has an equal probability of being selected, which is 1 by 1,000. In systematic sampling, as I said, so you systematically select every kth unit starting from a number which was chosen randomly from 1 to k. So, for example, from those 1,000 individuals, in every 50 individuals you want to choose one individual, so that first individual that you choose is random between 1 to 50. For example, you chose the 27th individual, and then after that you will choose every individual which is 27 plus 50, and then 27 plus 100, like that you will choose every individual. So it becomes systematic after the first random selection. Then there's stratified sampling, as I said. For example, you have a heterogeneous population. So in the image you saw, the population had green and blue individuals. So it's a heterogeneous population. So you divide it into subpopulations or strata. Each strata internally is somehow homogeneous. So you saw that the subpopulation internally was homogeneous. They were either green individuals or blue individuals. And from there, then you conduct a so for so these subpopulations are made or are chosen in a way that according to you, each strata should be internally homogeneous, so that if you get a precise estimate from that particular subpopulation, then that can give you a so that can be obtained if you sample this subpopulation. So, for example, you have a population, you divide it into multiple subpopulations, and now, according to you, if you take a sample from one of these subpopulations, it will give you a precise estimate of that particular subpopulation. So, based on that, you choose the strata, and then you combine the estimate from each of these subpopulations to get a good estimate for the population level. Okay, so to explain it from the image, here you have uh, a heterogeneous population, green and blue individuals. You divide them into two populations, greens and blues. Now, according to you, in these two subpopulations, if you take a sample from these green individuals, you will get an estimate which will precisely give you a measurement for the green subpopulation. And here you take an estimate which will precisely give you an estimate for the blue population. And then combining these two estimates, you'll get a good estimate for the entire population. So that is why we do stratified sampling. Then there is multi-stage sampling. In this, first you select large sized units, and then you choose a specified number of subunits from these selected large units. So, for example, you have this population. From this population, you divide it into some primary sampling units, and from those, you then come down to smaller units, and from those you finally choose the individual elements. So you keep, so for example, we had subpopulations in stratified sampling. Here in multi-stage you have big population, from that you make small populations, from these small populations you make further small populations, and from those you select your um, individual sample sizes. Okay, so that is multi-stage sampling. For example, say you are in one particular state. For example, you are in Karnataka, and you, or say, and then you want to measure the height of students, as I said, in 10th grade. Okay, for example, okay, don't consider Karnataka, consider Bangalore, and you want to measure the height of 10th grade students. Now, from here, you choose a particular, so yeah, there are different schools. So these different schools will be your primary sampling units. So from these schools, so you have subpopulations inside each of these different schools. Then you go, you choose a certain number of schools based on their proximity to you, and how which schools say agree to you measuring the height of their students and things like that. Then you choose these particular schools. From these schools, then you choose as a population. So in that 10th grade, how many students you would want to sample. So for example, you choose some sections at random. There is section A, B, C, D. So you choose some randomly. Some say you're going to measure the heights of students from the section B and from section D. So this would be your second level of second stage of sampling. And then from there, say you divide this into that one section into males and females. So so you have a heterogeneous population, but you divide it into two homogeneous subsections, males and females, and then you get one estimate each from these two, and then you average to get the heights of students. So like that, it will become a multi-stage sampling. Then there is PPS sampling, which is um probability proportional to size. So, for example, when you're measuring something, so for example, the units themselves vary in size, and the variable that you're trying to measure is directly related to the size of the units. So, for example, you're trying to measure the number of trees in a particular landscape, and then you have units which are the particular forest areas. So, the number of trees will um, is directly related to how much area you are measuring, right? So, if these measuring areas are your units, so on their size depends the variable that you're trying to measure, which is the number of trees. So, which units that you choose, or from which units you choose your area, should be proportional to the size of the unit. So, for example, you have one forest area which is 10 hectares, then the next one 20 hectares, then someone is zero point 0.5 hectares, like that, or 5 hectares. Then you would choose more land from that 10 hectare area, and even more from the 20 hectare, and lesser from the 5 hectare, to have a so your sample should be proportional to the actual size if the variable you're trying to measure is related to the size of the unit. Okay, so when the units vary in size and the variable that is being measured is directly related to the size of the unit, then you should assign some probability, and based on that you should which is proportional to the size of the unit. So whether or not that unit will get chosen depends on what is the size of the unit. So it's a technique where the probability of selecting a unit is directly proportional to its size, which allows larger units to get a higher chance of selection. Okay, so I hope that is clear. So whether or not you choose the unit in your sample depends on what is the size of the unit, because what you're trying to measure is related to the size of the unit. So that is what is PPS sampling. Then moving on, this was all about sampling and um, measurement. Then the next lecture talked about photogrammetry. So, what is photogrammetry? So, it is the science and technique where you're trying to generate precise 3D models or maps and spatial measurements by using 2D photographs. So, you go to a landscape, you take photographs, which are mostly a photograph is a 2D thing. So, you get like a 2D photograph. And from that photograph, you're trying to measure. You're trying to measure something precisely, or you're trying to reach to getting 3D models or maps out of these photographs. Now, it is a form of remote sensing. Why it's remote sensing? So, remote sensing actually refers to a process where you are getting information, you're acquiring information from the object without physically touching the object. So you're getting information from the landscape or from the trees in the landscape without actually going and measuring things or without actually touching the things. So you're just taking a picture, you're just getting a photograph of the landscape, and from that you're trying to reconstruct the measurements, or you're trying to get to the maps and models. So that is why it's called remote sensing, because you're remotely trying to get all the information that you can. So that is what is photogrammetry. And here you can see, for example, you have a drone which is flying over a landscape and it's getting an image of this particular field. So that's a way of remote sensing, because you are remotely getting an image of this area, and then you're going to measure what is the area, what are the number of trees in this field, what is the density of the trees in this field, and all of that. So, moving on to something called triangulation. So, you might have heard the term triangulation when there's talk of GPS or when there's talk of satellites. So, when you talk about triangulating a point, is um, when you have three different points, and then using that, you can get the exact location of one particular point. So, that's called triangulating information. So, it is used to perceive depth because you have 3 points. You can take multiple photographs and then process them by using the principle of triangulation to get the depth or distance of the points on the photographs. Okay, so you get a 3D view of the surface. So you use triangulation to actually get a 3D view of the surface. So you take photographs from at least two different locations. So, for example, this is your plane of land, and then you take two different drone pictures. And by using the points on these pictures, you can actually triangulate and reach at the actual location of the point. So you take photographs from at least two different locations. You develop lines of sight from each camera to the point of object, and then you mathematically intersect these lines of sight to get 3D coordinates of that point. So here you can see, as an example, you take multiple images, okay, and then, for example, you have certain points in this image and you have points in this image. Then you look at the lines of sight, and then you can reach at the actual location of that point, or how these different objects are distributed on land. Okay, so for the same land, for say this much section, you take a picture, and in this picture, these points look like this. In this picture, these points look like this. And then you actually look at what was the line of sight of the camera for these particular points. And then you start drawing straight lines from the line of sight to the land. And then at the points where three of these rays actually meet, that will be the actual location of that point. So that is called triangulation. And these certain of these points are ground control points. As we said earlier, for these we know the exact location. So for example, from the ground control point, you can actually say that, okay, in this image we see the point here, so this image would have been taken at this particular angle, and then based on that point you can see where all the other objects are located, because then you have a reference point as well. Or if you look at this, so there is this certain object, and you take a camera picture, and these are the two different angles at which you get this particular point, and then you know what is the height of the camera at which you were taking the image. So based on that, you can triangulate where that point is located. So you know the vertical distance, you know the horizontal distance. Here also you know the vertical distance and you know the angle. So based on that, you can get the actual location of the point. And this is multiple point triangulation, where you're getting the actual location of multiple points in that particular area. So this is how triangulation works. What is the application of using triangulation or of using photogrammetry? So first of all, it'll help. So if somebody is working with terrains, if somebody wants to say is managing a particular piece of land, it'll give them an interpretation of the surface. What is the terrain? Is it a plain surface? It's a slopey surface. Based on that, you would look at how you would want to manage that particular area. Um, so if it's a slopey surface, you would want to do certain different agricultural techniques. If it's a plain surface, you would want to do something else, things like that. So for example, if it's slopey, the water will run off. If it's plain, the water will accumulate, things like that. And it will allow you to measure the distance between different trees. So if you're for forest management, it will basically let you know what is the distance between these different trees that you're looking at in the image, and then you can measure that distance in actual land without actually going to the land and measuring that distance, just by looking at the different photographs of the same area. And so like that, it can tell you the distance between different objects. So this is the application of photogrammetry. There are three platforms that are used. Either you take ground born images, so basically you take an image from a camera on ground. So this camera is set up on a tripod and you take the image of the landscape from ground. Airborne, where I showed earlier, for example, either the camera is on an aircraft or on a drone, something like that, and or a helicopter. And if you take images from sky, then that is airborne imagery. Or spaceborne, you have a satellite and then you're taking the image from the satellite. So there are three platforms that can be used for photogrammetry, and there are different kinds of resolutions that you can get in these photographs. Either you can get spatial resolution, which says how many pixels cover how much of the ground. So if you have higher number of pixels covering the same amount of ground, then you have a higher resolution in that image. Temporal resolution, so what is the frequency at which, so how much time has elapsed between the two images taken of the same area. So for example, if you're talking about satellite imagery, so a satellite goes around the area in a particular time. So for example, one satellite goes over the area every month, another satellite goes over the area every 10 days, another goes over the area every 8 hours. So you have a better temporal resolution if you use images from the satellite which crosses the area every 8 hours, compared to the one which crosses every 10 days, compared to the one which crosses every once in a month. So that's about temporal resolution. Then there is spectral resolution, which talks about the number of frequency bands that are recorded. So in your image, what are the different frequencies, the lights that you're using? If you're using infrared photography, or if you're using UV photography, or if you're using normal white light photography. So based on that, it will tell you the spectral resolution. If you're using more and more different spectra of light, then that's a better resolved image compared to if you're using some broadband photographs. Then there is something called radiometric resolution, where you look at what is the intensity of these different radiations that the sensor is capable of distinguishing. So for example, you're taking an image and your sensor only gives you you'll get this better when I show you the image. So your sensor has a capability of sensing the light that is getting reflected from the. So for example, there's sunlight incident on the landscape, and light gets reflected and gets captured in your camera. So based on the sensor, what is the intensities that are getting captured by the camera, that will tell you whether it is better resolved or not that good a resolution. So when I was talking about spatial, here you can see there is this area which you take pictures of. So here you can see that this one has much more pixels. So it is much better resolved compared to the one which has less number of pixels, compared to the one which has even lower number of pixels. So this one has a better resolution. You can see the proper outline of the shape. Here you see a very rough outline of the shape. So it is this one is better resolved. Then this is about temporal resolution. At what frequency does the satellite cross the area and takes the images? So again, this is spatial resolution, how many pixels are in that of the image, and that will tell you which one's better resolved. Then temporal resolution, at what frequency you get the image from that area. Radiometric resolution tells you, say, if this is a 2-bit image, here you only see some shades of gray. You see lighter gray, a little darker, and like a black. But this one is even better resolved because you see different shades of gray. So different intensities of that radiation are being captured by the camera. So that's why you see different, so you get a better contrast of different objects in this. And then there's spectral resolution. Either here you're only capturing 3 bands, red, green and blue, and here you're capturing 9 bands. So every particular radiation is getting captured, or wavelength is getting captured differently by the camera. So that is why it is better resolved when you talk about spectral resolution. So these are the different kinds of resolutions that you get in your photogrammetry images. Okay, moving on to something which is called the NDVI index, which is the normalized difference vegetation index. So it calculates the vegetation health by comparing the differences between near infrared and red light reflectance. And it produces values between -1 to +1. So you basically have near infrared light, which is getting reflected by the plant, and then you have red light, which is also getting reflected by the plant. And when you look at the difference of the two, you get the NDVI index, and this gives you an idea about the health of the plant. So here you see it. So NDVI is actually near infrared minus red divided by near infrared plus red. So if you have high NDVI, means you have high vegetation health, and as you go towards lower and lower NDVI, you have a lower vegetation health in that particular area. Okay, so here the red light being reflected is less and the NIR being reflected is more, so it's high NDVI. Here they're more or less equal, so it's low NDVI. Here the near infrared reflected is less and red is more, so the NDVI is less. So it tells you how much vegetation cover is in that area, because uh, plants are green in color and they reflect the red lights. And yeah, okay. Uh, Moving on to satellite imagery. As I said earlier, basically this is the one of the three types of photogrammetry: ground borne, airborne, satellite borne. So this is satellite imagery. It is important for management purposes, and it's easier to obtain these days because there's so many satellites that are revolving around the Earth. It helps you make metric computation, so gives an idea between trees, or lets you check whether your plantation is overcrowded or not. So based on the resolution that you can get from the satellite images, you can see whether your land is overcrowded with trees, or if it's what kind of composition there is, how what is the diversity of trees that you have in the area. All of this information can be gathered from satellite imagery, and you can process these images even for other applications. Okay, so next is, how can you take good photographs of the landscape in order for your photogrammetry to work properly? So there are different factors that affect whether the photographs are good or not. One of them is, what is the field of view? So how much field of view are you able to capture, which depends on the focal length of the uh, camera lens and the angle at which you're clicking the picture. Next is the focus. What is the depth of field, which depends again on the f number of the lens. So there is either far range photogrammetry where the focus is at infinity, or there is close range photogrammetry where the focus is at some finite distance. So for far range, in which you can capture uh, where you capture, like where you get data from far away, or like for example, if you're taking an airborne image, then that's a far range photogrammetry. Space borne is even further than that, and close range would be the one where you're getting images based on ground. And then there's exposure. Exposure of an image depends on more different factors. One is shutter speed. So somebody, anybody who is aware of photography might know this already. So there are certain different factors that affect the exposure. One of them is shutter speed, which is for how long are you exposing the film of the camera to the outside light. So if the shutter speed is low, which means for a longer time the film gets exposed to light. If the shutter speed is high, which means it captures the image at a very short interval of time, so the film gets exposed for a very low amount of time. And there's aperture. Aperture tells you how much area, uh, like if the aperture is larger, then there's a large amount of area from which the light is entering the camera, so means more light is entering. If the aperture is low, then it means less light is able to enter, because the hole through which the light is entering into the camera and falling on the film is much lesser. So that's aperture. And then there's ISO, which is actually a measure of the sensitivity of the film. So how sensitive is the film to the light? So if better ISO means the film can react very quickly to the amount of light that it gets. So even if the shutter speed is low and the aperture is low, you'll still get a good exposure, or like a decent exposure. But if the ISO is low, then with the low shutter speed, the it's exposed to light for a very less amount of time, so it will not like develop into a very good image or a very clear image. And then there is lens. So the lens of the camera, as you know, is something that exposes the light from the object to the film. So it focuses the light onto the film. And if the lens is stouter, which means that the lens is more curved, you can capture a wider area, you have a lower focal length. And if the lens is thinner, then you can capture a smaller area because it has a higher focal length. So if you want to capture a wider area, you should use a lens which is stouter, has a low focal length. If you want to capture a smaller area, then you should use a thinner lens. So that is all about photography. Then you can look at what is the orientation of the camera. At what angle is your camera oriented? So, for example, if you're taking airborne images, you can either get a vertical orientation, which will be better for getting measurements, or you can have the image being captured at an oblique angle, and this oblique axis can either be a low oblique or a high oblique. When you talk about a low oblique angle, is when the horizon is not getting captured in the image. So the angle is oblique, you are able to capture a wider area, but you're not capturing the horizon. And if it is a high oblique angle, means you're capturing a bigger area, but the horizon is also in the image. So that is about the angles. So it's vertical, near vertical if it's a little bit off the 90-degree angle, and then oblique if it's at a particular angle. So what differences you see between these, which were discussed in the lecture, were this is better for measurement, the vertical angle, and oblique is not that good for measurement, but oblique gives you better information about the different features of the landscape. So if you have trees and stuff, the oblique can tell you about the height of the trees and can tell you about the different features of the trees, but the vertical image cannot actually tell you about the height of the trees because you're taking the image from a top angle, from a top down view. But if you have an optical axis, it'll give you a more, sorry, if you have an oblique axis, it'll give you more idea about the terrain and what are the different objects in there and how they are distributed. So that's how the orientation of the camera affects the information you can get from the images. Then there are different types of cameras that were talked about in the lecture. One is metric cameras, which are mostly stable, and they have stable internal geometries, and they have very little less lens distortions, and they have a very quite constant focal length. So they are good for taking measurements. So internally they are very good for taking the measurements from the landscape. So you don't really have to do much if you're using a metric camera. And then you could be using stereometric cameras. Stereo basically means having two channels of input. So when talking about stereometric cameras, you have a pair of metric cameras which can produce a pair of images. So these are mounted at ends of some precisely measured bar. So for here you can see there are two cameras which are mounted at two ends of the bar, and this bar is mostly 40 to 120 centimeters in length, and they have same geometric properties. For example, so that you're getting the image from two different points of view, but the properties of the image being captured are entirely the same. So they are in some sense comparable to each other. So that is why stereometric cameras are sometimes used to get a better sense of the landscape. Then the last lecture was about LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging. So it's a technique which incorporates laser plus radar. So you might already be aware about radar. Radar is a technique of where you use radio signals. So there's a source. From source you produce a signal. The signal gets hits an object and gets reflected from the object and reaches the source again. So the amount of time that radio signal takes to go from the source to the object and then come back from the object to the scanner, which is placed like close to the source, tells you how far the object is from the point of detection, from where you are, like from where you've placed the system, right? Now, when you're using laser instead of radio waves to do this, then that is called LiDAR, basically. So you use laser pulses to measure distance. So from the source, you send very short laser pulses at very quick intervals, and then you measure the distance of the objects by looking at how much time that laser pulse took from when it leaves the source to when it comes back to the scanner. So the lidar in itself has this both of these parts. One is the source and one is the scanner, which looks at when the laser has come back. And then you can use it to create 3D maps of objects and of the landscape itself. So you can create 3D maps either of the landscape, for example, if you're looking at buildings and trees and things like that, or hills and different terrains. It's a technique which comes under active remote sensing. So remote sensing can be divided into two sorts of. There are two types of remote sensing. One is active and one is passive. Remote sensing, as we discussed, is a technique in which you're trying to gather information without actually touching the objects. So you are remotely trying to gather the information. So in active remote sensing, you are actually actively putting in energy. For example, in lidar, we are sending the laser pulses. So we are actively putting in energy. So that is why it's called active remote sensing. In passive, you are just, for example, clicking pictures of the landscape, and you're not even using flash, you're just clicking pictures. So that is a passive sort of a remote sensing in which you are dependent on the ambient energy. So for example, on the sun's incident light. So when you're depending on that ambient energy, then that is a sort of a passive remote sensing technique. It's active when you are inputting some sort of a energy source. Then here you more or less use an airborne laser scanning technique. So your lidar system is actually usually on a object, for example on an aircraft or on a drone. So that's why it's airborne, and you're using laser sensing, so that's why it's laser scanning. So it's also called a airborne laser scanning technique. And why are we using laser and not just light? So that is because laser is monochromatic, so you can see the interaction of subjects with some specific wavelengths of light. So you can use different wavelengths, but at one time you only use one particular wavelength, and that is why it's monochromatic. And you can see how the subject is interacting with these different wavelengths, and it is directional, and the strength of the signal lasts for a longer distances. So you might know, if you have seen like a normal laser pointer, it goes in a thin beam and it can travel a longer distance compared to using like a normal light source. So that is some basic of lidar. Then here is a short video explaining lidar very quickly. So basically, from this video, we see that there are different components. One of them is, say, that airborne lidar system. So either on an aircraft or a drone, you have the lidar system which is present, which sends the laser pulses and then receives the reflected pulses back. So uh, from that, distance can be measured of the landscape or of the canopy, anything. So that's how you get the altitude or the elevation of that particular point. So you have the airplane which is there. For that airplane, you need to know the exact location of that particular airplane as well. So that is why you use GPS to get the exact location of that airplane. Now that airplane can be at different angles, and if it has because of turbulence, or because of normal, like when an airplane is flying there is turbulence, so it will be at different angles. So because of, you need to measure those as well, because if the airplane is at different angles, the light will be going at different angles, the laser pulses will be going at different angles, which will affect your measurements. So you need to know both the exact location of the aircraft, and need to know the different angles at which the aircraft might be pointing, in order to get the exact measurements. And to measure the distance, the formula that is used is actually, you look at the speed of light with which the speed with which the light is traveling, and then, as you know, distance is equal to speed into time. So it is speed into time divided by 2, because it is traveling that same distance twice. So c into t by 2, that is basically the distance of the object from the aircraft, right? So there are different concepts that we used. As I said, the distance is actually travel time into speed of light by 2. So there's a laser pulse traveling from the airplane to the ground. And then this laser can be going in different angles. So if it's going at 90 degrees, then it's called nadir, which is again terminology used in LiDAR. And if it's going off the 90 degrees, then it's called off nadir. And these are the different angles at which the aircraft could be pointing. So the roll tells you if the aircraft is like going flat or a little bit tilted towards the right or the left. The yaw tells you if the aircraft is whether the pitch tells you whether the nose or the tail of the aircraft is like tilted at any angle or it's straight. And then there's one thing, the yaw, which tells you if the aircraft is tilted in the third angle or not. So basically, it can either go like this, it can go like this, or it can go at the third angle. Yeah, don't know how to explain that, but yeah. So that's the third axis along which the airplane could be positioned. So you basically need to get the position of the aircraft, which you get by the differential GPS, where you use GPS to get the actual location of the aircraft, and the IMU, the inertial measurement unit. So this tells you if the aircraft is angled at any of these three axes. So yeah, so basically the aircraft could be straight. If it's like this, then that's some angle along the pitch. If it is like this, like horizontally, then that's some angle along the yaw. And if it's like this, like not going straight but it's going somewhere left or right, then that's the angle along the yaw. So you can see these different arrows pointing at these different axes, so you can get an idea of where the aircraft is pointing and how the laser might be pointing. And then you get the distance to the surface, which you're calculating here, the distance to the surface. You can get the distance. So from here you can figure out that you can get this distance directly to the ground, or you can get this distance to the edge of the to the height of the tree, to the canopy height. So you can measure different aspects of the landscape based on how quickly the light is coming back, the laser pulse is coming back. So it will tell you distances from all the different objects, from higher trees, lower shrubbery, and things like that. So you can get all of these information from the lidar unit. And then you track the angles also in order to get a 3D scan. So if you want to get a 3D image of this, then you also need to track all of these angles at which the laser is being pointed. So what is IMU, or the inertial measurement unit? It measures the motion and the orientation of the aircraft. So it it is basically a system fit inside the aircraft carrying the lidar, and it uses these two things, accelerometers and gyroscopes, in order to track what is the angle along the roll, yaw, and pitch, and it tells us how the aircraft is moving. And then talking about DGPS, which measures where the aircraft is, so it's even more accurate than a GPS system. So a GPS basically where you're using just the satellites, the global positioning system, we're just using the satellites. So that can be a little bit even off, even in the scale of meters. So you always see GPS accuracy to 5 meters, 10 meters, things like that. But if you're using DGPS, you get an accuracy for up to centimeters. So that's why DGPS is better than GPS. It's highly accurate. It corrects the normal errors that you get in GPS measurements, and it gives you the precise aircraft position. And in DGPS, what is different is, apart from the satellites, you have this one sensor, this one GPS station which is on ground. So this ground station helps you actually get a very accurate location of the uh, aircraft up to a few centimeters. So that was about lidar. Now there are some concepts which are used. One of them, so a lidar can be used in the LP mode, which is the last pulse. So when you send a pulse, so what is the last, like what is the longest it takes to return to you? So this will give you an idea about the land, about the landscape itself. Then the first pulse, or the FP mode, which will give you what is the shortest it takes to return to you. So which will give you an idea about the objects on the land, trees, buildings, things like that. Then there is DEM, digital elevation model. It tells you about the top of the canopy. So if you're going over a forest, then you will get some of these pulses that hit the land and come back, some of these that hit the canopy and come back. So DEM, digital elevation, tells you about the canopy. DTM tells you about the terrain, about the ground being captured. And then there is digital canopy height model. So using DCHM, which is DEM minus DTM, you can get the height of the canopy in that particular area. So these are different ways in which information can be gathered from LiDAR. And there are different types of LiDAR. One of them is airborne, where you usually capture images from the sky and you map large areas. So these mostly systems are mounted on airplanes, helicopters, or drones, and they're used for mapping forests, for measuring terrains, for mapping floods, and for large area surveys. Then there is terrestrial lidar, where you get a detailed scan from the ground itself. So if you want like a much detailed, much precise scan of a particular area, you will use a terrestrial lidar. It is mostly mounted on ground tripods or vehicles, and they're used for getting a measure of buildings, roads, bridges, or archaeological sites. So, for example, you see people using that uh, system on a tripod to get an idea about the particular you know landscape. For example, in forest research, a lot of the times this terrestrial lidar is used to get a structure of all the different layers in the forests, from emergent to canopy to understory and all of that. So that is where lidar comes in handy if you want to know all of these features individually as well. Then there is topographic LiDAR. As the term suggests, it mostly maps land, and it uses near infrared lasers. It maps the land surface, cannot penetrate water. So it's used for terrestrial features and used for mountains, forests, and road. Then there is bathymetric LiDAR, which maps underwater areas. For example, if you're trying to get the structure of the seabed, coral reefs, all these things, it mostly uses green laser because that can penetrate water. So when you're using LiDAR, you need to see how the laser is interacting with the medium in which it is traveling. So if the laser that you're using is going to get absorbed by the medium in which it is traveling, then there's no point. So your medium needs to be transparent to the laser you're using. So when you just want to try and map objects on the land, you can use infrared rays because they will not get absorbed by air. But you can't use this when you're trying to map things underwater. So for that, you usually use this green laser because it can penetrate water, and then you can measure riverbeds and seafloors. So it's usually used for mapping coastal areas, river studies, or to get flood risk assessment. So these are the different types of lidars. Okay. And now this was all about the lectures. So this was all that was discussed during the lectures. First lecture was talking about getting different using different types of classical tools to get measures of the landscape, in which we saw there's chain and tape method, there is this theodolite method, and these different methods. And then there we talked about remote sensing techniques, for example photogrammetry, in which you take photos and then you see how different how the landscape is structured. And then the last one was lidar, in which you use this technique for uh, again a remote sensing, but this time an active remote sensing technique to get different features of the landscape, and you can get even different measurements and things like that. So now we have a short quiz, so let's get started. First question is, uh, what are we talking about here? Here we're talking about this sampling employs a simple rule of selecting every kth unit starting with a particular number chosen at random from 1 to k. So, what kind of a sampling technique are we talking about here? Is this simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, or multi stage sampling? So, you guys can either type out the answers in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and tell me the answer. So, what kind of a sampling technique are we talking about in this sentence? So, it employs a simple rule. You select every kth unit starting from a random number chosen from 1 to k. Guys, we just discussed in the lecture. Anybody would like to take a guess? Or from the term itself, do you think it's simple random, systematic, stratified, or multi stage? Anyone? That's why I give like a small summary of the lectures that were conducted in the week so that you are able to, you know, understand the concepts that were talked about, ask any doubts that you might have. So, this is a very basic question which just asks you which sampling technique are we talking about? Nobody? Okay, that's disappointing. Fine. So this is basically systematic sampling. In systematic sampling, you, as the definition says, you basically select every kth unit starting from a random number chosen from 1 to k. Next, IMU stands for imperial metering unit, inertial metering unit, imperial measurement unit, or inertial measurement unit. So what does IMU stand for, which we just discussed in LiDAR? So what is IMU? Okay. Does nobody want to answer? Should I just give away all of the answers? IMU is basically inertial measurement unit. As we discussed in LiDAR, this unit is it employs accelerometers and gyroscopes in order to get information about the movement of the aircraft. It tells you what are the different angles at the yaw, at the roll, or at the pitch of the aircraft, whether the aircraft is pointing up or down, right or left, or yeah, whether it's facing right or left. Anyway, next question is dash is how close the measured values are to the correct value. Is it accuracy, precision, bias, or variance? Dash is how close the measured values are to the correct value. Yeah. So basically, so you're correct. Accuracy, it talks about how close are our measured values to the correct value. Next question is a list of sampling units is called what? What is a list of sampling unit called? Is it a frame? Is it a window? Sample population? What is it? So you guys are correct. A list of sampling units is called a frame. We just discussed that. Now there's a numerical type question. So the time of flight for LiDAR is 10 to the power minus 5 seconds. So the time that it takes for a laser to go and come back is 10 to the power minus 5 seconds. Find the distance of the object from the instrument. And you know that the speed of light is 3 into 10 to the power 8 meters per second. So it's a so you all now might know the formula that we discussed for distance. So based on that formula, can you calculate what is the distance of the object from the instrument? Distance is speed into time by 2. That was the formula for how far is the object from the instrument. So here we have time as 10 to the power minus 5, speed of light as 3 into 10 to the power 8. So can you tell me what is the distance of the object from the instrument? So yes, you are correct. So basically, as I said, it's speed into time by 2. So you have speed 3 into 10 to the power 8, time as 10 to the power minus 5 seconds. So you multiply that, you reach to 3000. 3000 by 2 is 1500 meters. So correct. Next question is which of these statements is correct? Plane surveying takes into account the true shape of the earth and is used for smaller areas. Plane surveying takes into account the true shape of the Earth and is used for larger areas. Geodetic surveying takes into account the true shape and is for smaller areas, or geodetic takes into account the true shape and is for larger areas. So, which of these statements is correct? So, we talked about two types of surveys, plane surveys and geodetic surveys. So, one of them does not take the true shape of the earth into account. One of them just considers earth as a plane and is used for smaller areas, and the other one considers the true shape of the earth and is mostly used for larger areas. And yes, you guys are correct. Took too much time, but yeah, geodetic surveys, as the term suggests, well, because the earth's shape is a geoid, so geodetic survey takes into account the true shape of the earth and is mostly used for larger areas. Next question is a sampling procedure such that each possible combination of the units out of the population has the same chance of being selected is what? So every unit has the same probability of getting selected into the sample. So what is the sampling procedure called? Is it simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, or multi-stage sampling? Yes, you're correct. This is simple random sampling. If each of the sampling units has the same probability of getting selected into the sample, that is simple random sampling. Frequency of flyovers is an indicator of. So we talked about different resolutions. We have spatial, temporal, spectral, and radiometric resolution. So what is the frequency of flyover an indicator of? So how frequently does the satellite or whatever flies over the landscape, and how frequently it takes an image? This would be an indicator of. Yeah, you're correct. It will be an indicator of the temporal resolution. So, how well resolved is the photographs over like in time? Dash is how close the measured values are to each other. So, we already discussed how close the measured values are to the true value. Now, dash is how close are the measured values to each other. So, is it accuracy, precision, bias, or variance? Here, the same um, options, and yes, the correct option is precision. Precision talks about how close are the measured values to one another. Now, photogrammetry works best when only one photo is taken, multiple overlapping photos are taken, the photos are blurry, or the camera is shaking. So, which of these options tells you when does photogrammetry work best? Yeah, so the correct answer is when multiple overlapping photos are taken. So when you're talking about photogrammetry, if you have a landscape, so if you take multiple overlapping photos, you can actually put them together and get one huge image of the area. And then that gives you a better idea of what is going on in the landscape, how much area is cultivated, how much area is forest, how much area is built. So if you take multiple pictures and then you overlap them, that's a better uh, way of doing photogrammetry. Now, where there is bathymetric lidar, what does bathymetric lidar use? We just discussed what is bathymetric lidar. What does it use? Far infrared light, near infrared light, orange light, or green light? So we discussed different types of lidars and we discussed the kind of light that they use. So bathymetric lidar uses, yeah. So bathymetric lidar is the one for which in which we capture the features underwater, and to cross water, you basically use green light because for that the water is a transparent medium. Which of the following is an advantage of photogrammetry? It requires no camera. It's very expensive equipment is required. It can cover large areas quickly, or it only works indoors. So, which of these is actually an advantage of photogrammetry? I think this question is very easy. So, what is an advantage? Yeah, so you guys are correct. From any of these, anyway, the advantages basically it can cover large areas quickly. So, as we know, photogrammetry, if you're doing an airborne photogrammetry, you're taking images or a satellite photogrammetry, you can cover large amounts of area very, very quickly. It can help you create 3D models, music playlists, weather forecasts, or paintings. So, what can photogrammetry help you create? Can you create 3D models, or can you create music playlists, or can you create weather forecasts or paintings? Yeah, so the correct answer is basically by using photogrammetry, you can get a 3D model of the landscape that you're looking at. So that was all for today. Thank you for joining the class, and these were all the questions I had for you guys. And this was all about fifth week, where we looked at tools for surveying forests or landscapes in general, talked about classical tools, sampling, surveying, and photogrammetry, how different sorts of photogrammetries work, and talked about LiDAR. If anybody has any doubts, you can ask me. You can either unmute yourself or type the doubts out into the chat box. If you don't have any doubts, you can exit the meeting. Thank you so much for joining. If people have any doubts, you can ask me. No doubts, everything is clear. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for joining.